Officially, the story from Ottawa is clear. The multi-billion-dollar purchase of the F-35 fighter jet is on hold. But behind the official statements, federal records reveal a different strategy. The government has quietly begun buying key components for those exact same jets. So, what is happening here? This isn't simple hypocrisy, it's leverage, a calculated move. And to understand this quiet maneuver, you first have to understand the $2 trillion broken promise that made it all necessary. That $2 trillion broken promise, it has a name. The F-35 Lightning II. It's the single most expensive weapons program in human history, sold as the unshakable cornerstone of Western air power for the next half-century. The problem isn't the jet's airframe or its engines. Those mostly do what they're supposed to do. The problem is its brain, a critical software overhaul called Technology Refresh 3, or TR3. This isn't an optional upgrade. It's the central nervous system that was meant to power new weapons, sharper sensors, and tougher cyber defenses. It was supposed to be fully in service years ago. Instead, it has slipped so far behind schedule that newly built aircraft are flying without the upgrade they were promised, and allied air forces that built their plans around those capabilities are quietly running out of patience. In the Pentagon's own 20/1.5 reporting, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation described TR3 as predominantly unusable because of persistent stability failures. When a test office calls software predominantly unusable, that doesn't stay on paper. It turns into a checklist item in a cockpit. Picture a pilot in an F-35 patrolling the tight, crowded airspace near Iran. Before takeoff, the briefing is blunt. TR3 still isn't stable, so tonight's mission will run on the older TR2 software. Some of the promised functions are grayed out on the screen. The system freezes often enough that you've been told not to touch certain menus at mid-flight. Now you're airborne. The cockpit is dim. The helmet display is feeding you a picture of the sky. Except the fusion track you were relying on suddenly drops, replaced by a warning that the system has reverted to a legacy mode. You glance down and see that the advanced tools and protections you were meant to have with TR3 are still unavailable. You know you are flying with software that lacks the modern combat and security protections you were told would be standard. The gap between the sales pitch and the actual code is not theoretical anymore. It's the space between you and whoever is tracking you from the ground. That is the $2 trillion betrayal. Not because the airframe can't fly, but because the brain that was supposed to make it decisive still isn't ready. According to the latest Government Accountability Office review, GAO 25 17632, the total cost to acquire and sustain the F-35 fleet is now projected to exceed an astronomical $2 trillion US. Just the acquisition portion has climbed to about $485 billion, an increase of roughly $89.5 billion over the 2012 baseline the program was originally selling to its partners. When the core of an alliance is built on a shared technological edge and that edge proves delayed and brittle, trust doesn't fail loudly, it drains away. Procurement meetings become contingency briefings, and those briefings happen in rooms where Washington's chairs quietly left empty. That empty chair wasn't a metaphor for long. By March 15, 2026, it had become something even starker. A blank space on a wall in Oslo. A long polished table runs the length of a quiet government room. Along the back wall, 6 flags stand in a row. Canada, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, the Canadian maple leaf beside the Nordic crosses. It's a picture of northern solidarity, but the real story is told by the gap on that wall where a flag is missing. There are no stars and stripes. Publicly, the meeting was about Arctic security and deepening defense production. That is the safe language you use after watching cornerstone U.S. systems like the F-35 blow past budgets and underdeliver. You start asking what your plan B looks like if Washington can't always come through. The United States was not invited to this meeting, and that was no oversight. It was a signal. Behind the scenes, it was the first concrete step in building a world where Washington's approval is no longer the prerequisite for action. The joint statement they issued was a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement, committing to independent northern frameworks to bolster regional security. In practice, that means tighter coordination of Arctic surveillance and basing between their own capitals and new formats where these six can decide on regional deployments and production priorities without first waiting for a green light from Washington. In the quiet language of statecraft, that is the sound of a backup plan being drawn up, a lifeboat quietly assembled while you're still a passenger on the main vessel. Once you see that blank space on the wall, you have to decide, is this just prudent risk management inside the alliance or an early rehearsal for operating without its traditional security anchor? Let me know how you read that scene in the comments. I do go through them. While we debate what that missing flag means, Canada is already building the answer into policy. This pivot wasn't just talk in Oslo, it showed up in Ottawa's paperwork. On the same day as the Oslo summit, while the Canadian delegation was lining up behind that maple leaf in Norway, another group of officials in Ottawa was unveiling a $35 billion Arctic defense plan. Same logic, two cities. In Oslo, Canada helps design an independent northern circle. In Ottawa, it funds the national piece of that circle, more Arctic-capable forces, infrastructure, and surveillance on Canada's own books. The scale is one part of the break, but the bigger one is in the wording. If you read the policy documents, which most people don't, the language is unusually blunt for Ottawa. It states that for security in its own northern region, Canada can, and I quote, no longer rely on others. There is zero ambiguity in that phrase. In a NORAD and NATO context, others is diplomatic shorthand for U.S. air cover, U.S. surveillance systems, and U.S.-built platforms like the F-35 that Canada has traditionally counted on to plug its Arctic gaps. The subtext is simple. After years of F-35 cost overruns, technical fixes, and sliding delivery schedules, that assumption is no longer safe. The fighter's failure has moved from a technical headache to a trigger for a formal, funded realignment of Canadian defense policy. That kind of quiet independence inside a formal alliance feels radical today, but it isn't new. 60 years ago, Charles de Gaulle did something similar in 1966. To understand where Canada is heading, we need to go back there. In the mid-1960s, the world saw NATO as a single shield against the Soviet Union. Its headquarters settled in Paris. On paper, that looked like unity. In practice, for French President Charles de Gaulle, it was a chain of command running from Washington through NATO into French forces, an early version of the sovereignty problem Canada is circling. To de Gaulle, sovereignty was absolute, no partial share, no outsourcing, even to allies. On Dagenham September 1965, he went public, announcing his intention to end what he called the subordination described as integration, which hands over our destiny to foreign authority. It wasn't a bluff tossed out in a press conference. He set a clock. By 1969 at the latest, this subordination would end. Then, sooner than anyone expected, the letter arrived in March 1966. France notified its allies that it was withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command. The alliance now had to rewire itself in practical ways. Shape, NATO's supreme headquarters packed up in Paris and shifted to Brussels. American and other allied units folded their flags, loaded equipment, and left French bases. NATO signs came down from gates that had opened onto joint facilities. On parade grounds that had flown 2 or 3 flags, only the French tricolor remained. Yet France did not leave NATO itself. It stayed in the political alliance, remained a signatory to the North Atlantic Treaty, and kept its seat on the NATO Council while pulling its forces out of the integrated chain of command. That split is the heart of the Playbook de Gaulle wrote. Stay inside the treaty, inside the consultations, but recover full control over how and when national forces are used. For capitals watching, the message was clear but quietly delivered. An ally could step back from automatic military integration without walking away from the West. Later debates about burden sharing, nuclear policy, or U.S. dominance unfolded under that shadow. De Gaulle's 1966 decision hangs over NATO like a ghost, evidence that the alliance can bend around a determined member state that insists on room to move. For Canada, that ghost matters. Ottawa's unease about relying on one fighter program, one supply chain, one command logic isn't a rupture with allied loyalty. It fits a pattern first tested in Paris 60 years ago. The playbook existed. The path was clear, and just as Canada began to turn to that very page, the world broke. It didn't break with a grand explosion, it broke with a single, chilling confirmation, sliding across allied secure channels into defense ministries and energy desks across the Western Alliance. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil, had been effectively shut down. A regional conflict involving the United States and its partners, escalating with breathtaking speed, had just severed that artery. And because the alliance itself ran on that same fuel, what started as a regional fight instantly became a crisis of dependence. Within hours, tanker tracks on the maps thinned to almost nothing. Captains held position, insurers froze coverage. In the days that followed, an analysis from the Dallas Federal Reserve put a hard number on what operators already knew. A 95% collapse in shipping through the Strait. That wasn't a slowdown, it was a full stop. Roughly 20% of the planet's daily oil supply had just been removed from the market. On trading floors in London, New York, and Tokyo, the reaction was immediate and violent. Prices didn't drift higher, they lurched. Each refresh pushed crude deeper into the red zone. UNCTAD's March 2026 report would later freeze the peak in print. Brent crude at $126 a barrel, West Texas Intermediate above 90 a serve. From there, the shockwaves moved fast, out of oil into natural gas, and then into the fertilizers that quietly underpin global food production. This was not an abstract crisis for economists to argue about. It showed up as a sharp, unavoidable line item in ordinary budgets. Drivers watched the price at the pump jump in what felt like real time. News tickers started running with warnings of supply chain disruption and delivery delays. Only then did people look up and notice the fine print. The goods you ordered, the parts for your factory, the medicine for your pharmacy might simply not arrive. The system that had been sold as resilient and diversified was behaving like a single point of failure. One choke point closing in the Gulf was enough to unsettle grocery bills in Toronto and diesel costs on the prairies. For nearly every nation, this was an economic body blow, a catastrophe with no clear end date. But it was also something else, a forced repricing of every energy plan, every alliance promise, every quiet realignment that had been underway in the background. As the panic spread and governments scrambled for answers, the rules of the game were quietly rewritten. And for one country in particular, that rewrite did not just mean pain. For Canada, this same global emergency was not only a crisis, it was the winning hand. And that winning hand looks like a map of North America, but a map where all the colors, all the lines of power have quietly been redrawn. For decades, the flow of resources from Canada to the United States was a given. It was simply there, the quiet, reliable pipeline from the north. Today, more than 60% of all the crude oil the U.S. imports comes from Canada. Alongside that is the natural gas that keeps furnaces running, the aluminum that goes into cars and aircraft, and something most people never think about. Potash, the fertilizer ingredient that underpins North American food security. Convenient? Yes. But in Washington, rarely treated as truly critical. In calm years, those same inputs were bargaining chips, threatened with so-called national security tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, folded into softwood lumber fights, pulled into dairy and auto disputes whenever a lever was needed. The message was simple. Your resources are useful, but we assume they will always be there. Then, the Strait of Hormuz closed. Overnight, convenient turned into existential. When global supply chains are cut, ships from hostile or unstable regions simply stop arriving. In that moment, the value of a reliable, stable neighbor becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, that quiet pipeline from the north is not just a line on a map. It is a lifeline. And this realization comes at the worst possible moment for one country and the best possible moment for another. Because all of this hits just before the mandatory 2026 review of the CUSMA trade agreement, the replacement for NAFTA. That review is the arena where the United States has historically held almost all the cards, threatening to scrap NAFTA to force new auto rules of origin, pushing hard on access to Canada's dairy market, shaping digital trade and dispute settlement rules on its terms. It is the table where Canada has spent 3 decades mostly playing defense. But this is the moment where all the threads come together. This is the payoff. Start with defense. When the F-35 program slid into technical failures and cost overruns, Ottawa got a harsh lesson. Even the American flagship system could fail to arrive as promised. That did more than derail a fighter procurement file. It cracked the old assumption that, in the end, the U.S. defense industrial base would always deliver. From that point, every serious planning document in Ottawa began to carry the same quiet note. Never be single-sourced for anything that matters. Not for aircraft, not for surveillance, and eventually not for trade and energy either. The Oslo summit took that instinct and turned it into architecture. By deepening ties with northern allies on Arctic surveillance, shipping routes, and energy coordination, Canada built a second spine of security and export options that did not run solely through Washington. It signaled to anyone paying attention that Canada was preparing credible alternatives, allies who could help patrol its skies and seas, and new markets that could absorb at least part of its oil, gas, aluminum, and potash. So when Hormuz shuts down and global energy flows seize up, Canada is no longer chained to a single customer. The U.S. suddenly faces shortages and price spikes at home, searching for secure oil, gas, aluminum, and fertilizer. Canada, for the first time in a generation, holds 2 things at once: the capacity to ease that crisis and the option to redirect more of those barrels and tons elsewhere if the terms are wrong. That combination is what walks into the 2026 CUSMA review. The F-35 fiasco has already weakened blind trust in U.S. systems. Ottawa knows it cannot afford to be dependent in the way it once was. The Oslo network has already shown that alternative security and export pathways are real, not theoretical. And Hormuz has turned Canadian resources from nice to have into the most reliable lifeline on the continent. At the CUSMA table, those 3 threads translate into concrete leverage. Canada can insist that the kind of national security tariffs once aimed at its steel and aluminum are taken off the table. It can push for stronger automatic dispute settlement mechanisms instead of ad hoc threats. It can defend long-protected sectors like dairy and other supply-managed agriculture with the knowledge that, in energy and fertilizer, the United States now needs stability more than Canada needs marginal access to one more slice of the U.S. market. For Washington, that is a jarring reversal. For decades, Canadian negotiators arrived asking themselves which concessions were necessary to preserve access to the American market. In this round, they sit down knowing that a secure flow of oil, gas, and potash into the United States is just as vital to U.S. domestic stability as cross-border access is to Canada. The board is not just flipped. The old playbook is unusable. And none of this is an accident. It is the product of a decade of quiet course corrections, questioning automatic Buy American defense choices after the F-35, investing political capital in northern alliances that gave Canada other security anchors, and keeping key resource corridors and contracts flexible enough to pivot when a crisis like Hormuz hit. Taken together, those moves add up to a doctrine for a middle power that wants real room to maneuver while staying inside its alliances. It has a specific name. It is called Embedded Autonomy, so Canada holds all the cards, but this isn't about tearing up the alliance. It's about playing a new, smarter game from inside it. That game is what we can call Embedded Autonomy. In plain terms, embedded autonomy means Canada stays anchored in the US-led system, but uses its new leverage to quietly redraw where it is dependent, where it is not, and on what terms. It is not a dramatic break. It is a methodical renegotiation of dependence from within the existing structures. You can think of it as 3 simple moves. First, you stay embedded. Canada keeps NORAD, NATO, and integrated supply chains. It does not walk away from the core alliance architecture. Second, you use system failures or new bargaining chips to rebuild capacity at home in specific high-leverage sectors. Third, you plug that new capacity back into the alliance so that Canada's autonomy and its value to partners increase at the same time. You can see all 3 moves in the F-35 story. In June 2025, the Auditor General reported that Canada's F-35 program was running $8.7 billion over plan, up to $27.7 billion, almost 50% above the original $19 billion estimate, with major facility delays and not enough pilots trained to use the jets on schedule. Under the old pattern, Ottawa would have complained quietly, absorbed the extra cost, and kept sending most of the work abroad. This time, those overruns and delays became justification to change course. Within a year, in February 2026, the government released a defense industrial strategy that aims to lift the share of defense contracts going to Canadian firms from about 43% to 70%, alongside targets for domestic jobs and exports. On the surface, Canada is still buying the F-35 and remains inside the US-led program. Underneath, it is shifting a large share of the next dollars, maintenance, upgrades, related systems, toward firms at home so that future capability is less exposed to a single foreign supplier. That is embedded autonomy in a weapons program. Stay in the alliance, use a failure in the system as leverage, quietly move production and control back to Canadian ground, and then present that new capacity as a contribution to the collective. The same pattern shows up in resources, not just aircraft. Critical minerals are now formally treated as a national security priority under Canada's Defence Production Act. Ottawa is setting up stockpiles and policies to guarantee supplies of these minerals to NATO allies. Again, Canada is not stepping away from alliance commitments or threatening to cut partners off. Instead, by treating these minerals as a security asset and managing stockpiles and supply routes from home, it keeps tighter control over a resource base the alliance cannot easily substitute. That is embedded autonomy in a supply chain. Canada reinforces NATO's access to critical minerals, but does so in a way that makes its own territory and decision-making central to how those minerals flow. The alliance gets security of supply. Canada gains more control over a strategic choke point without breaking ranks. When you strip it down, embedded autonomy becomes a lens you can apply across files. Ask 3 questions. Are we staying inside the alliance structure? Are we using shocks, like F-35 overruns or a global resource crunch, to pull key production and control points back home? And are we then offering that capacity back to partners in ways that make Canada harder to sideline, not easier to pressure? That is the new, smarter game Canada is starting to play. And in the final chapter, we will look at what happens if this approach continues to mature, how a country long treated as a junior partner can quietly move into a position where it helps set the terms of the very system it still depends on. This strategy of embedded autonomy is not just about surviving the present. It is quietly designing the next decade. Over the next 5 to 10 years, Canada is positioned to move from simple resource supplier to a middle power architect. In practice, that means Ottawa sitting at the tables where NATO capability plans and Arctic security architectures are drafted, not just announced, and using its critical minerals and industrial capacity to shape which weapons and sensor supply chains allies consider secure. In that role, Canada can trade manufacturing capacity and Arctic expertise for co-lead status on specific projects, co-write specifications for joint intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms tailored to the High North, and make co-production on Canadian soil a standard condition for major programs that draw on Canadian minerals or industry. Two levers make that shift plausible rather than aspirational: resource leverage and industrial capacity. On the resource side, the March 2026 announcement of 30 new critical minerals partnerships expected to unlock $12.1 billion in project capital ties Canadian reserves into planned mines and processing instead of just spot markets. Through frameworks like the NATO Critical Minerals High Visibility Project and the G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance. Those projects are mapped onto allied security needs. By making access to Canadian inputs a planning assumption inside NATO and G7 processes, these arrangements convert geology into structural influence over how allied supply chains are built. On the industrial side, the Defense Industrial Strategy unveiled in February 2026 created a specific tool, a Defense Investment Agency. Its mandate is to run joint procurement and collaborative projects with European NATO allies and other G7 partners, giving Canada a stake from the design phase, not just at the checkout line. To turn that mandate into real co-design power, the agency has to focus on a few critical domains and lock in long-term work shares for Canadian firms. The point is to move beyond simply buying foreign systems like the F-35 on Allied recommendation. Instead, Canada positions itself as a co-equal partner in designing and building the next generation of platforms, particularly those that secure the Arctic approaches and northern airspace. Done properly, that could mean shared development of next-generation Arctic domain awareness systems and common ISR platforms for the North Atlantic. Canada is shifting from off-the-shelf buyer and resource price taker to co-developer of key systems and rule shaper in the supply chains that feed them. A government that once approached NATO and G7 tables asking what to buy now has reasons to arrive with conditions: co-production tied to critical mineral access, and Arctic-focused sensor packages built to Canadian specifications. For viewers, pragmatic confidence means expecting more initiative from Ottawa in alliance agenda setting and less automatic deference to whatever package is put on the table. If understanding these hidden currents of power and how they are shaping our future is valuable to you, consider subscribing for more analysis that connects the dots.